Mythic Plus needs help. There are way too many punishing factors for people, leading to leavers.
Bye, have a great time.
The rewards are subpar, so you are not incentivized to keep playing. On top of this, Mythic Plus is repetitive and creates discrimination where people cannot play what they want.
Can I stay?
No.
But this can all be fixed and made to feel fresh and new and constantly interesting for at least the next 2 expansions. Let's start it off with the rewards. There's not enough of them. We need better loot for higher keys, because doing higher keys, and we're going to get into that a little bit later, is just not rewarding at all. And not even higher keys. You cannot go for 3 to 4 dungeons in a row with no loot. That does not feel good. That's about 2 hours of gameplay and you get nada. You get a little bit of gold at the end. It's not acceptable. Another thing about this that will fix other issues is to add extra loot for healers and tanks, either similar to LFG when there's, you know, a tank and healer shortage, or simply just by default to incentivize people to actually play tank and healer. And this cannot be tied to loot specialization so that people can cheese the mechanic. No, the actual tank of the dungeon gets to have a guaranteed loot piece, and the healer as well, a guaranteed loot piece, and so on. This will make it so that we can actually push people to play these 2 roles. The lack of tanks and healers makes grouping very annoying because their job is either boring or too tedious, unfun, or unrewarding compared to the level of work they put in. Put a vendor up that sells weapons and trinkets for dungeon currency and an armor token vendor similar to what we have with Dream Searches, and it can still maintain the elements of RNG if the armor is random. This will fix the amount of RNG loot issues that will make sense a little bit later into the video. The vendor can use something like 10 tokens for a weapon, and we get 1 token for any key, 2 for 10 keys and above, 3 for 15s and above, 4 for 20s, just off the top of my head. That way the key levels can be relevant and their difficulty relevant for the gear. Note that this is already implemented in the live game, but with gear quality, aka champion, hero, myth level gear. If that remains the case and we can keep those gear types, at least let us upgrade gear quality by using a certain number of relevant crests so that it doesn't feel like I have to constantly re-loot the same item. This is just another different version of Titan Forging, except that now it's tied to higher level content, which is arguably better, but still we constantly have to re-loot the same item piece, and that is boring. Now, whichever one of these 2 is implemented, bring back a version of BFA Scrapper where we can destroy the loot we get for crests or the said dungeon currency, or at least let us sell it for relevant gold. More rewards can also mean a cosmetic dungeon set that we can loot as a reward for our Keystone Master. Maybe we can get 1 item from the set to be rewarded for any plus 15 or 17s or whatever key number they decide to be that we do in time until we actually have the full set, or just have the full set be rewarded once we actually get the Keystone Master achievement. People go to great lengths for cosmetics, and mount is just getting a little bit old. You can keep the mount as a reward for, I don't know, the first plus 20 done in time, or a full world tour of plus 20s, so that once again key level matters. And it doesn't have to stop at just cosmetics. Have the dungeons reward set items that work only in the dungeons, or these could be effects disabled while outside the dungeon. The effects can be anything so long as they make the dungeons fun, counteract affixes, or other forms of punishments that are annoying to go through for the sake of being annoying. And as it would probably be obvious, the sets can even be tuned in a way where it could fix balance issues between certain specs that seem to overperform a lot more than others as well. And speaking of punishment, there are way too many layers of punishment for underperforming and failing a key. At least 1 of these has to go, although ideally only keeping 1 from the punishment list would probably be ideal. And the list starts with the lower loot drop once you fail a key. We already get very few items for our time investment in a key, but we also lose out on 1 item if the key is failed. Not to mention that if the key does end up failing, we get to the second punishment, which is the key being depleted to a lower level. I already worked getting my key to a plus 22. Why do I have to redo a plus 21 just to have another chance to do that plus 22? Just keep the key the same level. If you really want to, you can just RNG the dungeon on it once again so that it can swap to a different dungeon. Sure. 24, but just keep the key as it is because I got to a 22. I don't need to do another 21 to get to a 22. Another form of punishment on top of all of these, which is something that's a little bit more abstract, is the time invested that is then lost, and it is in conjunction with the two that I just mentioned. This leads to more people leaving keys since the perceived time loss is too huge to invest in attempting to complete the key that they perceive to be a lost cause. This leads to a lot of people just leaving the key and everybody else in that dungeon feeling pretty bad. If the punishment for doing and failing a key gets reduced drastically, I might add, you will see a massive reduction in people leaving. The fourth type of punishment is affixes, which this makes it very difficult to discuss about them because it's contentious. Affixes make Mythic Plus what they are, and I'm not sure that they should go away, but essentially all affixes are designed to slow the player down with no upsides. Now currently we had Kiss Curse affixes before, and funnily enough, the affixes that did give players a boost were the ones that people found the most enjoyable. It's not about losing the affixes or making them weaker. It's about the fact that they are not worth it. What's the upside of making the dungeon harder and harder when the rewards stop scaling? And even if they didn't, they are clearly still not enough. And the affixes themselves come with a plethora of other issues. Affix combos being better or worse in some weeks, resulting in the so-called push weeks, is just stupid because once again, the rewards do not scale. How about making the perceived bad weeks where people don't push? And we know this is happening because we have multiple websites that track these and the level of keys that people do during those weeks. How about making those weeks reward better loot? Maybe higher eye level, maybe one extra item per dungeon, maybe more gold, maybe crafting materials, anything to make it not feel like, oh, this week I'm just not doing Mythic Plus because it's a bad affix combination. How is this good for the game and how is this fun? The timer and essentially the deplete timer is also a big problem. Essentially, this decides the depleted factor, but it's a double form of punishment because time is inherently a price people pay for the run of the dungeon, and time is pretty important for modern gamers. Not only do they pay the time, but if the time they paid is too much, aka key went over the timer, they lose that time. The key gets smaller, they get less loot and less score and a fail on their resume. Just remove the timer affecting depletion. The timer can remain the same only to decide if the key is upgraded or not, or use a different system than just the timer. And this can have multiple benefits. First of all, casual players will get less pressure while doing dungeons, and by extension, more people will get into Mythic Plus, leading to more people playing WoW. They can also play whatever spec they want because there's no more pressure in losing the key or lowering the key or having less loot, because we're talking about removing all those punishments. Then they can just play whatever they want. The pressure factor on the meta being played will not be as high since there's less to lose if the key is not done in time. And essentially they still have their punishment in that the key can last longer if they decide to just play for fun and not worry about the meta, which is enough of a punishment. The keys currently last about 30 to 40 minutes, 20 to 40 minutes rather, let's say, and that's already a long chunk of time to dedicate to one piece of content that may actually prove to be a loss of time. That's part of the reason why people are not playing as much today as they once used to. And the second form of punishment that they will still get is that the key will just not upgrade if the timer takes way too long. People can decide then play for fun and just not be super punished, or they can focus on optimizing and play like hardcore players, which essentially will play more meta specs and min-max their playstyles. For those players, they will be rewarded with the keys will just not deplete to a lower level, leaving the option to attempt the key again, to do it instead of just doing a lower key, just for another chance to attempt the OG key level once again. Since they will play meta specs and play optimally, they will have faster keys, meaning they will do more keys, they will loot more, they will get more score. And as part of the punishment, if they play suboptimally or they fail or they've reached the wall, then they have the same essential punishment as the casual players. But enough of all of these. How do we make Mythic Plus more fun? Well, first of all, let's talk about the dungeon pool. Dragonflight introduced a couple of really cool stuff like rotating dungeons each season, which is helpful and fresh and has contributed to a lot of people actually playing in season 1. They also added all the dungeons in the mix, which was very good for both season 1 and season 2, albeit with mixed feelings concerning certain dungeons, but it added fresh content for, surprisingly enough, a lot of people that did not play during those expansions. Not to mention that just rotating dungeons during a season eliminates the need need for a seasonal affix, which is fantastic because seasonal affix was by and large disliked by the player base. But this can be better. We can add just more dungeons, and we should have more dungeons. Personally, I want to play more Dragonflight dungeons. They are good dungeons and I like how they're designed. But I will just get 2 next season, which is actually 1 because Dawn of the Infinites is just split in 2. Plus, there might not be a season 4 from what we know so far. So that means that through the course of Dragonflight, I only play each Dragonflight dungeon once per season, and that's it. And they are so fun. How about just doubling the dungeon pool? Why not? Keep 6 of the currently 10 dungeons that we have in Dragonflight, because, you know, Dawn of the Infinites is split, so we have 10 up from 9, and you can add 6 more. And obviously, these numbers are just off the top of my head. They can be anything as long as there are more dungeons. And there are so many options to choose from. We already have 10 dungeons in Shadowlands, but let's say we don't want to bring that back. But 12 in BFA. Legion had 14, and these expansions had Mythic Plus designed for them, or rather the dungeons designed for the Mythic Plus. But we have seen that other dungeons prior to the Mythic Plus being introduced were fun as well. Warlords of Draenor have 8 dungeons that we can choose from. Mob has 9, Cataclysm 14, Wrath 16, TBC 16, and Classic had 20. Maybe not Classic, because Jesus, those some of the dungeons were pretty long. But there's plenty of options for 3 to 4 seasons per expansion in rotating and mix matching the dungeons in the dungeon pool. The increase in dungeon pool can also be solved by the gear vendor if we're talking about the increase in loot pool by adding more dungeons. That would probably affect the vault as well, which is probably an issue that we're gonna be discussing in a different video. And not to mention that the dungeon vendor is just something that players have been asking for ages. Why do we not care what the players want? Is it not enough that they're leaving the game and not playing anymore? Maybe that needs some more consideration. And as proof of this, a good implementation of a gear vendor was the last season of Shadowlands, the Fated season, which arguably enough has been the most fun season that we have played and the most fun season gearing. Is it a coincidence that we had the vendor? Probably, because obviously if it wasn't a coincidence, we would have had the vendor once again. And if Dragonflight proved anything in terms of dungeon design, is that making them more interesting makes them more interesting, funnily enough. We just need more outside of the box thinking for dungeons, and they cannot just be like 1 dungeon per expansion. Bring back shorter dungeons like Maw of Souls. I know there's this meme of people being forced to spam Maw of Souls for 10,000 times, but that's because you chose to do that and you were part of the 1%. In Legion, I played +10 to +15 dungeons and rated heroic. I was the epitome of casual play, and I did not farm Maw of Souls 10,000 times, so I bet your butt the majority of the player base did not encounter that particular issue, and that can also be mitigated by addressing the loot table or the loot options accordingly to the length of the dungeon. And that's one thing. How about having dungeons with 5 bosses and almost no trash, or dungeons with 2 bosses and thousands of trash? People like to kill a lot of stuff in video games. That's a known fact. And the best example of this is the backlash towards the capping of AoE. How about adding dungeons that go against the AoE cap? Instead of AoE capping classes and making them objectively less fun, keep designing unCCable mobs that are mandatory to be pulled and need to be interrupted, or managed in a way where if you pull too many, you wipe. We already have these mini lieutenants, range casters that cannot be gripped or stunned, casters that just cast destructive wipe level spells that need to be constantly kicked, and if we have too many of them, we just don't have enough kicks for everybody, so naturally the pools will just be smaller. How about controlling AoE that way instead of just gimping players, which is not fun? You're essentially just taking fun from players. And this way the devs can control the dungeons and how much the meta devolves into mass AoE pools, which is actually not fun only when it happens in every dungeon, but now we don't ever have it. Or, you know, you can just leave the AoE cap as it is and instead make awesome mechanics like what Algathar has, where NPCs give you buffs, and this time it can be based on your class or your role. It can be stats. It can be something like 5% extra attack power for every warrior in your group. This can promote silly comps like all warriors and a healer, or it can be for other classes. You can have a full druid party and actually be rewarded for it. This can be tuned to reward stronger stuff for classes that are less played, less strong, or meta. They can be tuned to help other underperforming specs and eliminate meta issues. NPCs can give the people a choice between stats or class mechanics like Bloodlust or Dispels or Soothe. That way, we eliminate, once again, the need of a specific class or a specific spec, leading to discrimination towards the specs that do not have these types of utilities, because we have talked about classes not bringing stuff to raids, although this is Mythic Plus, but it kind of follows the same trend. There are classes that just don't bring anything to the team whatsoever, and they are just benched from pushing higher and higher keys by players, even wrongfully so. And for those who bring the said utility, they can just be rewarded with extra stats because they just opt for the other option. Specific dungeon mechanics can also be the uncapping of AoE abilities. How about going into a dungeon, you speak to this guy, hey dude, let's uncap AoE abilities, and he says, right on dude, and then you just blast. Sure, this might need some scripting and some coding and things like that, but that's what the devs are for. We pay you money, you give us game, right? And this essentially can just forego the redesigning of AoE, which was once again what people had a lot of fun with back in BFA before the AoE cap happened. We simply need more out-of-the-box mechanics and out-of-the-box thinking in terms of design. Something like for every trash mob you kill, you get a stacking buff of haste or other stats. It can enable outrageous and fun gameplay like we had with Corruptions in the past, where we just become machine guns of spells for one dungeon or one season or one pair dungeons. You guys can decide. You can add mini games or puzzles that, if completed, rewards the party with giga boosts of movement speed, something like 300% movement speed to invalidate mounts. Let some dungeons be done while mounted. We already have this system in the game, and it's called Nagrand back in Warlords of Draenor. These positive mechanics can be similar to weekly rotating affixes, where they can be tuned and adjusted based on god comp scenarios, aka if your tank is not a bear or you have no augmentation in the group, one extra item in the loot. It cannot always just be stats for damage. The rewards, buffs, affixes need to shift from being just pure damage and just add more interesting and fun stuff to do. Take a page out of Torghast's book for what it's worth and have powers at the beginning of a dungeon like we've had in the whatchamacallit Azure Span zone that has just elites and you just collect powers and powers and powers. Is it a coincidence that at the beginning of the expansion, even if people were not using it to spam leveling, they just did it because it was fun? Coincidence? Once again, we can have stuff like for every yard walked while mounted, you shave a second off of your timer if the timer will be kept in. Just simply be interesting, because the game is doing a lot of things actually cool and is just not keeping things fresh, which is a shame since the game actually is fun if you just take a break every once in a while. And if you do take a break, you might not know about the fact that the god comp is getting nerfed and that Demon Hunter Havoc especially has a rework coming, and we already covered it in this video together with all the buffs to all the classes and the redesign of tier sets. It's a good time to play World of Warcraft.